Right in. So today we'll be covering Revit model health and project analytics. And as we mentioned earlier, we'll have the Q&A session at the end. So as the questions come to you, just go ahead and punch your questions into the Zoom tool, and we'll try to get those answered at the end of the presentation. Here's the agenda, some of the topics we'll be covering today. I'll make an effort to define model health, including how to maintain an efficient Revit model. I'll share some of my experiences on what causes corruption in a Revit model, and I'll go over some workflows and tools to monitor and diagnose your Revit model health. And again, towards the end, we have that Q&A, so I'd love to hear any questions and comments that all of you listeners might have. So first, here's a little about myself before we get started. I'm a Revit MEP certified professional, and I've been using Revit MEP since 2005. You can see some of my work in the background of this slide. So I've got over 13 years of experience in the building industry as BIM manager and VDC coordinator. And in 2016, I founded the Dynamo user group in Seattle, which now has about 175 members. So a few days ago, we received a comment on one of our polls requesting to define model health. And I thought that was a great comment, and I'd like to actually address that today on the webinar. And I personally don't think there's a correct or straightforward answer, because model health can be defined differently by different people, sort of like different strokes for different folks. And however, I think we can simplify the answers, so in an effort to keep the end goal in mind throughout this webinar. And I personally feel, and of course you can agree or disagree, that model health can be approached with two simple goals in mind. So one, a healthy model is efficient, and two, a healthy model is not corrupt. Now, I realize this may be oversimplifying a bit, but I believe these are the goals to strive for when talking about a healthy Revit model. At least in the Revit world, these are what define a healthy model. So now, the questions we really should be asking ourselves are, how do we maintain efficiency, and how can we prevent corruption, or at least try to prevent corruption? So with all that being said, let's start talking about what makes for an efficient Revit model. Now, at this point, I think it's important to highlight the term efficiency, because as Julie and I were speaking earlier, we realized there are actually two different ways to define efficiency. So you've got the workflow efficiency, which heavily relies on quality. So that means any sort of standardized shared parameters and data, and those all affect the efficiency of your team and their workflow. But today we're actually talking about efficiency of a Revit model, so it's much more technical. It's more of a way to manage a file, if you will. So what I've done is I've taken these top 4 points directly from Autodesk's website. So starting at number 1, audit the model periodically. And if the file is work shared, it's best practice to also detach from central when auditing. And my understanding is this helps clear out some of the cached files that you accumulate while syncing to central. Number 2, purge unused. So this gets rid of unused families, line styles, and text styles. And among other things, it also is, I would like to recommend to purge with caution, as you can accidentally remove standards from a model that have the intention to be used, but just haven't been placed in the model yet. So again, use purge unused with caution, but definitely once your model is established, I think that it's usually safe to purge frequently. Number 3, warnings. So resolve as many warnings as possible. So too many warnings can actually increase file size, and it can also greatly impact performance. So the scary thing about warnings is they're really easy to ignore and forget about. So I remember working on a 500,000 square foot hospital project where I had ignored the warnings for months. And then when I finally went and decided to sift through those warnings, I found that our team had accumulated around 1,500 warnings in a single model. So that would be attributed to why things like sync time and crashing were happening. Number 4, compacting the model. So this is an interesting one, because many think that compacting the model is compressing it to decrease file size. However, this is not necessarily the case. Steve Stafford had a nice short write-up on the Autodesk Knowledge Network describing how compacting the model actually allows Revit to remove records that are no longer required. So apparently Revit will maintain records in its sort of database just in case you'll ever need to bring them back. But for all of you techies out there, he uses the analogy of defragmenting your hard drive rather than compressing the file. So now let's talk about model corruption. This is actually a tough one to cover, and it seems that even Autodesk can struggle with this at times. And you know what I mean if you've ever contacted Autodesk's customer support only to have them to send your model to this ivory tower where they magically fix it before sending it back. Now, in my experience, there have been two frequent causes for Revit model corruption. And again, these necessarily won't be a catch-all, and they won't solve every problem. But number one has been corrupt families. So along with my own personal horror stories, and maybe we can cover one in the Q&A if anyone's interested, several users on Autodesk forums have similar issues with model corruption due to bad families. And this is actually the very reason that BIM managers are so picky about where their teams are getting their content from. Because the BIM managers are the ones who have to deal with the repercussions of a corrupt Revit model due to corrupt families. So no, BIM managers are not just quality control freaks. Well, they might be, but they've actually probably been burned a few times and just would like to fully vet any family that goes into their models. And then number two, using different software versions. So this seems like a no-brainer. You can't even open a 2019 Revit model in 2018, but the reality is the different minor versions, such as 2018.1 versus 2018.2, those different minor versions can corrupt your models as well. So I've actually personally experienced this as well. And worst of all, in that instance, I've had to chase down users to find out who had the different Revit builds, not only internally, but externally. So I've had to call different firms and figure out what everyone's builds they were using. They're sending screenshots of about the version in Revit to figure out who was on different versions. And it's also worth mentioning now that this seems to be an even bigger issue when working on BIM 360 design, or formerly known as C4R, because this is a known issue for the minor versions to corrupt your model. So it's definitely something that we all need to keep an eye on when working in that collaborative environment. So now that we've talked about what makes for unhealthy models and some reasons that cause corruption, let's talk about some methods to actually review model health. So undeniably, the most difficult and time-consuming way to review the health of your model is to manually open each model individually and review the contents of those models. So I realize that this may be the only option for some of you, and to be honest, I was in your shoes not too long ago, but there really are tools out there at your disposal that will save you time and money in the long run. Some of them cost money, and some are actually freely available, and the best part is more and more seem to be popping up every day. So another option, if you're one of those BIM folks who have taken it upon themselves to learn how to code, so let's say in C# to develop your own Revit add-ins, I'd say hats off to you. I've also learned to code. I've taken a few online courses and developed a few add-ins of my own. And for those of you who are considering it, my advice to you is go for it. It's a highly sought after skill set in our industry and really helps you think outside of the constraints we face from a software level in our industry. However, I think it goes without saying that developing your own add-in actually takes a significant amount of time, and it will hit your firm's overhead. So writing code, debugging, compiling, deploying, and maintaining all of that code, all of this is non-billable, so I could see it being an uphill battle to sort of promote the idea to your higher ups who are actually approving budgets for things like this. A similar route to developing an add-in is using Dynamo to pull raw data out of your models. Lots of folks have successfully taken this route, such as Arcolab and Gensler, which you see in the screenshots here. And first and foremost, I'm a huge advocate for Dynamo for many reasons. I mean, I founded the Dynamo user group in Seattle, and I'd much rather develop a Dynamo graph than develop a C# add-in for most cases. And I absolutely turn to Dynamo whenever I see any opportunity for automation. But Dynamo, for the task of monitoring model health, I think has its downsides. And there's a reason why on this slide I explicitly call this a semi-automatic workflow. Because as far as I know, you need to have a model open to run a Dynamo graph. And this means if you're managing dozens of models that you'd like to collect data on, you still have to manually open each model to run the script. And then also, furthermore, once you pull that data, you need to push the data into a third-party application to generate some sort of a report, whether it's Excel, Power BI, Tableau, or any sort of other analytics tools. It does seem like a 2 to 3 to 4 step process. And that doesn't even include the development of the Dynamo graph itself. So again, Dynamo is a great tool for automation, but in this case, for model health monitoring, it actually still requires some manual labor. So here's what I'm calling the easy way, and I'm looking at model health from UNIFI CORE's new feature. We're calling it Project Analytics. So keep in mind that if you're a current UNIFI CORE customer, you already have access to this feature. And you can actually manage 20 projects for free, including with your current license. So earlier when I mentioned that some tools out there are freely available, for our current customers, this is actually one of them. So Project Analytics is a feature that we designed to give you insight into your Revit projects. And it's important to know that this data is collected automatically every time any user syncs to Central. So it's not task-based. You don't need a dedicated machine for this. You don't need to open your Revit models to run a Dynamo graph. And what's best is now you can actually have visibility into every single model in your company without opening Revit. And I will show you an example of that here a bit later in the webinar. Now, I'm going to jump into a live demo. Now, this isn't meant to be a technical demo, but keep in mind we can set one up for you if you'd like to see all of the cool stuff that Project Analytics can actually do. But today, in the best interest of this webinar, I'm just going to highlight some of the features that address the problems that I stated earlier in this presentation. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up Project Analytics. All right, so first let's talk about Revit Warnings, because that's one of the issues that I identified earlier on in this webinar. So they can in fact make your model become unstable, less efficient if these warnings get out of hand. So right here, you're seeing a health indicator table, which actually allows you to view how many projects in Project Analytics need attention due to them having too many warnings. And again, well, I haven't mentioned it yet, but I will show you how you can actually set the number of warnings and even categorize these warnings to your liking. Because as I said earlier, different firms might want to weight certain warnings in different ways. So let's actually jump into the settings now. You'll see here that once you have implemented Project Analytics on a model, Project Analytics will start gathering all of the Revit warnings that exist within your project. So you can have the capability of categorizing it as critical, non-critical, or you can choose to ignore them. So certain warnings actually, one firm might consider critical, so a room not properly enclosed, maybe an architecture firm considers that critical. Flex duct, again, critical. So this is how you're able to actually, Project Analytics is helping you sift through these warnings. It's not just giving you a big roll-up of one report of all the warnings that exist, but it's actually giving you a health indicator and contributing to a health score. So if I were to jump into a project, we can also identify here which models have which warnings. So let me go ahead and jump down here. We can see critical Revit warnings. This particular model, Demo Project 2019.RVT, has 10 critical warnings, and it's actually going to group them here. So it's actually grouping them as 2 critical warnings here. But however, it's a great interface to be able to see those warnings. Down here, we're actually just showing you the actual warning itself. So not only is this a statistic, but showing you the actual word-for-word warning. Jumping back over to the project, the project space, I want to share the Revit version check. So earlier I had mentioned how critical it is to maintain the same minor version. So Project Analytics also monitors that for you as well. So as far as I know, I don't believe Dynamo or other scripting tools can accomplish this type of version check. But here in Project Analytics, we are able to monitor that. So you'll see here the check, it actually is telling me that all users are on the same major and minor versions. If any users were on a different minor version, this would turn into a yellow icon. And if somebody had synced, maybe accidentally upgraded to a different major version, this would turn into a red icon. So let's talk more about content now, because again, content is one of, in my experience, one of the major issues with causing model corruption. So we actually are able to give you visibility into your models, all of the content. So as you can see here in the drop-down menu, we can see if someone's imported CAD files. We can see the sheets, the work sets that exist within that model. But here's where it really gets interesting, is the families, because again, bad content can cause corruption. So it's important to know which families exist in your model that are UNIFI, meaning coming from UNIFI CORE, which is our content management system. So UNIFI standard, we can consider this a standard library, a standard piece of content from your approved library at your firm. Non-UNIFI, meaning it came from an outside source. So whether or not one team member had downloaded it from the internet or somebody from another firm had sent them something, we are able to actually track that here all with data. And it's great here, our interface actually allows you to filter. So you can actually just start to identify directly which families are non-UNIFI. And if you go into the ones that are UNIFI, the source from UNIFI, you can also check for versioning. So you can identify if a model if a family needs to be updated, because you can see here that the current version in the model is version 5. However, the current version in your UNIFI library is 17. So at this point, you might want to address that and think, maybe I need to go into that model and update it. One more piece that I'd like to share with everybody on Project Analytics is comparing changes. So I like to show this feature off because it actually, so there are other tools out there that do compare changes, particularly Autodesk has one that shows you sort of graphically what's changed. I know that they'll color code model elements. We're actually able to show you in terms of data what actually changed. So here you can see that somebody had maybe deleted 6 return diffusers. They've deleted 40 supply diffusers, and that somebody is actually identified here by the user. So Megan Green had synced, and this is the change that had occurred. And this is a great QA tool in my opinion, because things like rooms, you can see here that one of the rooms, 2 of the rooms actually went down to a 0 area, which typically would mean that it lost its boundaries, or there's something strange going on with that room. Maybe it's unplaced. So these are some of the features here for being able to monitor changes in your model, which I do think attributes to model health, or at least helps you monitor them. All right, so that actually wraps up the live demo piece and also moves us into the QA portion of our demo. And again, use the QA tool. I'm sure I'll go ahead and hand it over to Julie now to go ahead and start issuing the questions, and we'll get those answered.
Well, we have one question right now, and I believe that it was more or less about the about Project Analytics, and it says regarding the warning settings across all models. Justin asks, does it remember the settings for the warnings across all models?
Yes, that is correct. Let me jump back over to the Project Analytics, and I'll show you what that means. So something I didn't really get into detail about is what the project space actually means. So this is actually the company level. So within a company, you'll have multiple projects, and within a project, you'll have multiple models. So at this level, where you're actually controlling the Revit warnings and categorizing them, is actually at your company level. So you don't have to necessarily go into each model or each project to adjust this. This is all controlled at the company level. Julie, are you there?
I was talking on mute.
Oh.
I have a bad cough, audience. I'm very sorry about that. So I keep having to cough and muting myself and forgetting to come back on. So yes, everybody send in some more questions. We don't have any other audience questions right now. But Jay, as far as it going for project analytics working within different work sharing environments like BIM 360, what are some of the different work sharing environments that it integrates with, the project analytic integrates with?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you mentioned it right off the bat. BIM 360 Design, formerly known as C4R, you can actually track analytics on that cloud platform as well as Revit Server. Really, I don't believe there's a limitation to any of those solutions on how we're tracking analytics because the data is collected from a local level.
You know, we might be able to change this up since this did start off with the topic of BIM health or model health. And maybe we can throw some different questions out into the audience just to find out what are some of the different challenges that they're facing with model health and be able to have some offshoot conversations with that. So posing the question, how often are members from the audience dealing with Revit crashes or file sync problems that are making a less efficient design phase for your firms? Maybe let me know how often this is happening for you. We could pose a second question as well for you guys to participate with. What are some of the, actually we've got some questions coming in for that. Oh, so we've got one more on project analytics. Is there a way to view an issue in the model directly from this portal?
So that's an interesting question because to be honest, I'm not sure what the asker is referring to as an issue. Whether it's a warning, perhaps. I'm actually not quite sure I understand the question. So maybe to the anonymous attendee that asked that question, maybe if you could rephrase, I can try to answer that for you. Just if I could take a guess, I mean, viewing issues, I mean, if you were to call a warning an issue, you can view warnings directly in Project Analytics here. Perhaps an issue could be sync times. We actually are able to track sync times and view that over file size. So I like to use the example here of when a sync time jumped up a few seconds or maybe a minute. Maybe if the file size didn't jump up with it, you could identify that as just a network issue. Or if the file size jumped up and the sync time stayed low, that could be a sign of a good, healthy model. I'm not exactly sure if I'm answering that question.
Well, Anonymous did ask also, how would we be able to, so say within a model, how, if there was a family that was causing a specific issue, how would we be able to see the family within here?
Okay. Great question. So you can actually view all of the families that live in your model. Now, to identify if that family has an issue, that would be probably trickier, but we do give you the family name. So I'm assuming at that point you would just, as a BIM manager or whoever's troubleshooting that issue, would just have to open the family and just try to figure out what's wrong with it.
So yeah, this is the way that you're able to view the families. What you can also tell within here is the, if you take a look at the columns, it'll also give you an indication if it's a UNIFI, and I think you had already gone through that, Jay. So that can help as another indicator of whether or not the content should or should not be in your model. With regards to the source, with regards to and what version is in the model and what is the current version that's housed within UNIFI to give you a better idea. So say if you know that the current version that's in UNIFI is at version 17, and yet the model that the version that's in the model is 5. If that's something, if you guys are fine, if you're fine with using revision 5, and that's the version you want, then that works out. But if you can take a look at this and go, wait a minute, we actually are supposed to be using 17, then you're able to kind of take a look and troubleshoot and do some quality assessments within the model based on this information as well. So it'll help you identify where some of the different problems are.
Absolutely. Well said.
Okay, so we have Justin Justin, I will get back to your comment of for the secondary questions we asked and stuff to start talking about some of the different ways of tracking. Justin asks, does it show if a family is corrupt in this data?
Currently not, but I really like that suggestion. I'm not sure, so I'm not really on the developer side, so I'm not sure if it's even possible through the Revit API, but I will definitely pass that up to our product manager and see if that's something that we can get on the roadmap, because that would be great to be able to just directly in the screen be able to identify which families are corrupt.
And I do think that when we take a look at, there's also that one feature within Project Analytics that shows you at every sync, what were some of the different updates or what were the differences within the model at every different sync. So if you have something where you see that a sync has dramatically changed in length or file size, you can kind of take a look at that specific history and take a look at what families were added within that sync, and that can help to further detect what family may be causing a problem and then help detect what family may actually be corrupt.
Correct. There is one thing to note as well, if I could just add on to that response, Julie. There are instances that I've run into where the families, actually there are no new families added, and it actually takes a while for these issues to surface, which is frightening. But we do give you the ability to backtrack, so you can continue to move back between syncs and see what changed between multiple syncs. Now, again, I do realize that there are times where a family will just kind of live in the model for, you know, weeks or hours or months, and it won't cause a corruption until much later. But at least we give you some insight in being able to kind of go back to every sync and see which families were added and maybe start to diagnose the issue that way. Because without this tool, I mean, speaking from experience, the only way to do it is to what do they call it, reverting backups. You can actually open a backup, but it's still an extremely manual process to find which families were added with each of those versions. Within this way, you can actually just see it right here in the form of data.
Very cool. Justin had another question. I believe, Justin, it sounds as though you're already using Project Analytics, and they had started with a test file. And so they're looking to see how they remove that project and the associated data from the test file.
Sure. So removing the project is really as simple as these three dots. There's a menu here. When you go to project space and then projects, there are these three dots, and we hit delete project. Now, simply turning off analytics, it's important to know that turning off analytics does not delete your data. It just stops collecting it. But deleting the project here would be your answer.
Okay, Justin, I hope that answers your question. So any other questions out there for model health or project analytics in general? I'm curious to find out, is anybody on here, of those of you that are using or have or actively maintaining your models, what kind of solutions do you have in place right now in order to do that? Other than, or if you're using Project Analytics, it'd be great to know, but if you're also if you're a non-customer right now and taking a look at some of our solutions, we're interested in learning what are some of the different solutions that you've investigated, or what are some of the solutions that you have in place right now that you might be looking to replace. Okay, Justin's mentioning that they did try that and it did not delete. So Justin, in that case, I think what we might be able to do is take that conversation offline, and maybe we'll reach out to you directly through customer support just to help work through that and see why that might not be working for you. And I can go back to one of my original questions as well. So with regards to the right now, with the different challenges that you may be facing right now that are being caused by the challenge in being able to maintain model health regularly, such as corrupt files and long sync times and Revit crashing. How often are some of you experiencing these issues? I don't think we're getting any feedback on that one. So, oh, actually, too. Okay, so Justin mentions to avoid corruption, we compact daily and we audit with each opening and purge weekly.
Yep, that sounds about right. I mean, those are the items that I covered as well in this presentation. But so I guess question for Justin, now that this has sort of turned into a different, like a different form of a Q&A, what about monitoring the contents of a model? Is there a solution that you guys are using for that? Because I agree, to avoid corruption, those are the basic steps to take, but there are times when you're working in a large team and you've got, you know, maybe 6 to 8 people that are on a team and just adding content, maybe downloading families from websites, manufacturer families, or from other firms or stuff that they've built. I'm just curious if there's a way that other folks are actually monitoring that type of content. And again, while we sort of think on that, I'll just sort of show you guys some more of the features of how you can actually gain visibility into these models. We talked about families. We've also talked about CAD links and imports, views we're building out, but right now we can actually see drafting views. Sheets is a nice one because there are times when I've had project managers that would not want to get into the Revit environment, but they like to know what sheets exist, maybe to see progress on the project. Looks like Justin's got some more feedback as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Justin's mentioning that they've been using Excel and manually checking, but have started testing UNIFI Analytics, and that Excel is used to track the results right now, and to avoid corruption, that they also will not import any CAD files.
Right, yes, that is a well-known issue as well. So Project Analytics does give you insight as to any CAD imports that live within your model, and we're even counting the instances.
So just out of curiosity, even Jay, this is a question for you. When it comes to being able to, for a CAD import, is that something that, how much control does a BIM manager typically have over something like that? Is that something that is completely under the control of the BIM manager, or is that kind of a rule that people sneak those situations in? Can they kind of squeak in past the authority of a BIM manager?
Yeah, there's really no way for a BIM manager to control the loading of a family.
So it's more or less a situation where it's a governance or a policy that you're putting in place. Justin, maybe that you can confirm. So it's more or less like a governance or a policy that you're putting in place on the use of content, not to make sure that nobody imports CAD files. However, knowing that some people might, for some reason, do things they shouldn't and add stuff into the models that they really shouldn't be adding in, either intentionally or by accident. And so that's one of the benefits. That's one of the areas that we're able to kind of detect where there's that best laid plan where for content management to make sure that you've got the right governance in place, you've got the right policy in place for content use, but then there's also the opportunity to kind of gain insight into what your designers are doing or what the design team and modelers are doing with content that might be outside of the policy or might actually help inform policy in the long term, being able to see these things of, hey, wait a minute, we didn't realize that by them doing this, it was actually going to cause these additional problems. And now with project analytics or other analytics setups that you might have, you're able to gain these insights to help inform policy and to help actually start policing the policy.
Right. So agree. Yeah, and it's interesting because you can set policies in place and you can do your best to enforce them. But specifically with multi-office firms, it gets really difficult, especially if you were to kind of zoom out and look at it from a sort of umbrella level, you know, like if you wanted to monitor multiple offices' work. You can have your local BIM managers kind of, they're in there, they have their boots on the ground, they've got their hands in these projects, they're able to sort of QA and control these models. But if you're, say, a design technology manager at the corporate level, you're not in projects, right? You're actually, this is the tool that will help you kind of stay out of the weeds and just get a really high level view. But actually, I will say you stay at a high level virtually, but you're actually able to dive really deep into these models without having to open the models themselves. So again, enforcing policies is one challenge, and I think that challenge is always going to exist. With anything that we talk about, right? You can only enforce standards so much before somebody goes rogue, or maybe they just aren't trained properly. So it's interesting. It's an interesting question, and I don't think there really is a way to enforce a standard set of content in Revit. The only thing you can do is sort of monitor what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Okay, well, we don't have any other questions specific about project analytics. I think that unless there's a couple questions that come in the next couple seconds, we'll probably be calling the webinar to a close. Give it a couple more seconds. Well, Jay, it sounds like you've been able to provide a lot of valuable information. There's not a lot of additional questions. So on that note, if you want to sign off with everybody, go right ahead.
Yep, I just wanted to just close out with saying thanks everyone for joining. This has been the second episode of BIM Like a Boss, and I hope that it has given you all some insight into how to keep your models healthy and avoid corruption. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.